Get off my range, right now. I don't care who sent you." Colonel Ethan Caldwell pointed toward the gate like he was dismissing a recruit on the first day of boot camp. 40 elite operators froze. Every eye on the firing line locked onto the woman standing at the entrance, quiet still, a worn rifle case in her hand, as the most powerful commander at Black Ridge Special Operations Range publicly threw her out in front of the entire field. She didn't argue, didn't flinch, didn't reach for a single credential. She simply picked up her case, nodded once, and walked away. That nod would cost him everything. If this story already has you gripped, subscribe to our channel and stay with us to the very end. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Colonel Ethan Caldwell arrived at Black Ridge Special Operations Range. He arrived exactly the way he always did, 15 minutes early. Coffee untouched, jaw set like concrete. He walked the line before anyone else was awake. Not because regulations required it, because control required it. Because there was not a single square foot of this range that should exist without his knowledge, his approval, his signature, written somewhere in the architecture of how it functioned. Black Ridge wasn't just a facility. It was the extension of his authority made physical. Every target, every lane, every weather sensor, every wind flag positioned at precise intervals across the canyon approach. All of it bore the fingerprints of his decisions. 31 years. That was how long Ethan Caldwell had been building this reputation, and he wasn't going to let one classified evaluation unravel it. The briefing had come down 3 weeks ago. Eyes only. A joint assessment initiative bringing the top precision shooters from multiple branches together for a multi-day evaluation at Black Ridge. The results would determine team composition for something higher up the chain. Something that had the kind of classification level that made even senior officers speak in half sentences. Caldwell hadn't been given the full picture. Nobody had. That was the point. What he did know was that his range was the proving ground. And nobody failed on his range. Not because he covered for weakness, but because weakness didn't survive long enough to reach the final evaluation. He stood at the edge of the canyon approach, hands behind his back, and looked out across the terrain. He knew better than his own face in a mirror. The canyon ran roughly northeast to southwest, deep enough to create its own weather, wide enough that a shooter on the elevated western ridge couldn't rely on anything they observed at ground level. The thermals off the eastern rock face ran contrary to the prevailing wind at every hour after 10 in the morning. He knew this. He'd designed the final course target placement specifically around this phenomenon. I wanted to see who understood what they were looking at. He wanted to separate the shooters who relied on their resumes from the shooters who still had a functioning relationship with reality. He allowed himself a brief moment of something close to satisfaction. Then he heard boots on gravel behind him, turned, and saw his Operations Sergeant Vasquez approaching with a tablet and an expression Caldwell recognized immediately as, "Sir, there's a situation." "Talk," Caldwell said. "We've got a walk-on, sir. Showed up at the main gate about 40 minutes ago. No pre-coordination in the system, no name on the manifest. Gate personnel flagged it to me when she didn't have documentation matching our access roster." Caldwell took the tablet. He scanned the information. Name, Voss M. Branch affiliation listed as contractor. No rank visible, no unit identifier, no contact number for a supervising officer. "She," he said. "Yes, sir. Walk on. No documentation, no manifest entry." "Correct, sir." "And someone let her through the gate." Vasquez's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She had a valid base access credential, sir. The gate personnel confirmed authenticity. They just couldn't place her on our specific roster." Caldwell handed the tablet back. "Where is she now?" "Staging area, sir, near the equipment check station. She hasn't asked for anything. She's just standing there." "Waiting for what?" "That's unclear, sir. She hasn't spoken to anyone since she got in." Caldwell started walking. Not quickly. He didn't rush for situations like this. He walked at the same measured pace he always did, because pace communicated certainty, and certainty was the first thing a commanding officer broadcast before a single word came out of his mouth. He found her exactly where Vasquez had described. Standing near the equipment check station. Not sitting. not leaning against anything. Standing with a worn canvas rifle case set up right beside her, like she'd put it there 10 minutes ago and had no intention of moving it. She was younger than he expected. Mid-30s maybe. Average height. Nothing about her clothing announced anything she wore. Plain field utilities, no visible unit patch, no name tape. He could read from where he stopped. Her hair was pulled back. Her posture was quiet in a way that he immediately recognized as deliberate. The kind of stillness that some people learned and others were born into. She was looking at the canyon, not at him, not at the operators already running pre-evaluation checks 20 yards away. At the canyon. "Voss," he said. She turned. Her eyes were dark, steady, and completely unreadable. "Colonel Caldwell," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. Which meant she'd done her homework. Which meant this was not an accidental arrival. "You're not on my roster." "No, sir." "You don't have pre-coordination documentation with my operations team." "No, sir." "Then you'd like to explain to me what you're doing on this range, standing 40 feet from a classified evaluation staging area without an invitation." She didn't blink. "I was asked to observe." "Asked? By whom?" "I'm not able to say that in an open staging area, Colonel." Caldwell looked at her for a long 3 seconds. Then he looked at the rifle case beside her. Old canvas. Worn at the corners. The kind of case that didn't come from a supply catalog. The kind that accumulated its character through use, through transport, in places that were hard on equipment, through years of handling by someone who didn't treat it as an accessory, but as a working tool. He looked back at her. "You have a name tape missing from your uniform." "I do. That's a uniform violation on this installation." "You're correct." "And you're speaking to a full colonel without producing rank or credentials." "I understand." There was something in the way she answered him. Not defiant, not apologetic. Every response she gave was precise, economical, and offered absolutely nothing beyond what his question had directly requested. It was a kind of fluency, the specific fluency of someone who had been questioned under pressure enough times that they no longer experienced it as pressure. That more than anything bothered him, because it meant she wasn't afraid of him. And on his range, in his staging area, in front of his operators, who had now quietly stopped what they were doing and were watching from a distance, with the studied pretense of people who were definitely not watching, that was not something he was prepared to allow. "This is a classified evaluation," he said. "It is not open to civilian observers, contractors with unverifiable affiliation, or anyone not explicitly cleared by my operations staff. You came through my gate on a credential that got you to this staging area. It will not get you 1 foot further." "Colonel, I'm not finished." He kept his voice level. He wasn't performing anger. He was performing authority, which was a different thing, and he was very good at it. "You're going to pick up your case. You're going to follow Sergeant Vasquez back to the main gate. And if whoever asked you to be here has a legitimate reason for your presence on this range, they are going to contact my operations center through proper channels with proper documentation, and we are going to have a very different conversation through a very different process." He watched her face. She absorbed his words without expression. Then, after a pause that lasted just slightly longer than expected, she nodded once. "Understood, Colonel." She reached down and picked up the rifle case. She didn't argue, didn't produce a credential he hadn't seen yet, didn't drop a name, didn't make a threat, didn't show the slightest indication that being removed from this staging area represented any kind of injustice she felt entitled to resist. She just picked up the case and turned toward the gate. And that quiet total compliance landed in Caldwell's chest like a stone dropping into still water. Because in 31 years, he had never met an operator, a legitimate one who accepted dismissal that cleanly. People who had standing fought for it. People who knew they belonged somewhere pushed back. Even with respect, even with professionalism, they pushed back. They said, "I can explain, sir." They said, "If you'll allow me a moment, Colonel." They produced something from their pocket. They made a call. She did none of that. She simply left. Vasquez fell in behind her. Caldwell watched them go for exactly 4 seconds. Then he turned back toward the range, reset his expression to its operational default, and addressed the operators, who had been watching with the polished non-interest of people pretending to check their optics. "We're beginning in 20 minutes, he said. "I want everyone on the line in position, no exceptions." The evaluation was his. Everything was under control. He believed that completely. The first hour of the evaluation ran exactly the way Caldwell had designed it to run. The opening sequence was standard distances any serious precision shooter should own without thinking. 300 meters, 450, 600. The operators on the line were by any reasonable measure extraordinary. These were not range pretenders. These were people who had made shots in conditions that didn't belong in a textbook wind elevation, stress time pressure, the particular and irreducible weight of a decision that couldn't be unmade. They performed. Clean. Consistent. Methodical. Caldwell walked the line and said almost nothing because there was almost nothing to say. His rangemaster, a lean and precise sergeant major named Hollister, tracked the data beside him on a pad, calling impacts logging times, making quiet notations that Caldwell reviewed with brief glances. "Group's tight on lane 4, Hollister said quietly. "Operator Riggs, he's been consistent all morning." "He's been consistent in weather that isn't testing him yet," Caldwell said. Hollister didn't argue. He'd been working with Caldwell long enough to understand that good was never a resting point. Good was a platform to identify what came next. What came next was the canyon. The second phase of the evaluation moved the operators from the standard flat-range sequence to the elevated western ridge position, where the final course target sat at extreme distance across the canyon floor, 940 meters, with the added complexity of the terrain-generated wind environment that Caldwell had spent years learning and specifically designing this course around. He said nothing about the wind patterns. He gave no additional briefing. He stood back and watched. The first operator took position. Staff Sergeant Dominic Reeves' combat tours in 3 different theaters, a documented precision record that put him in the top percentile of his unit. He settled in, ran his data, adjusted his dope, controlled his breathing, and fired. The impact was off. Not badly, but off. Maybe 14 inches left of center at that distance, which at 940 meters was a miss that mattered. Reeves fired again. This time the adjustment he'd made was logical, given where his first round had gone. The second shot went further left. Hollister didn't say anything. Caldwell watched. Reeves fired a third time. He'd overcorrected and the round went right past center and hit the edge of the target zone. He paused, looked at his data, made a slow, careful recalculation, fired again. This round drifted left again, almost to the same point as the first. Caldwell heard the intake of breath from the operators waiting behind the line. Not panic, but recognition. That's wrong and nobody knows why. He stepped forward. "Reeves, pull back." The next operator rotated in. Captain Marlena Ford, a woman with a reputation for cold-weather long-range work in Norway and Alaska. She took her time, noticeably more time than Reeves had taken on his initial setup. She was reading something, the wind flags, the vegetation movement visible on the far canyon wall, whatever data her instruments were giving her. She fired. The shot went wide. Not in the same direction as Reeves. A different direction. Which meant her read of the environmental data had led her somewhere entirely different, and it was equally wrong. "Pull back," Caldwell said. Operator after operator rotated through. And with each miss, each inexplicable drift, each moment where a shooter's adjustment made the problem worse instead of better, the quality of the silence behind the firing line changed. It thickened. It acquired a kind of texture that Caldwell had learned to read the way he read weather. This wasn't the silence of observers politely watching. This was the silence of elite operators processing the uncomfortable possibility that they were not understanding something they should understand. After the 8th miss, a younger operator named Chen, 26 years old, with a precision record that had people at his home base calling him a once-a-generation natural, lowered himself carefully from the position and looked back at the range. "Colonel," he said, and his voice was controlled but carrying a question underneath it. "Is there something about this lane that we should know?" Caldwell looked at him. "Should there be?" The drift pattern is inconsistent. Reeves went left. Ford went left, then right. Sergeant Okafor went high. If it was a single prevailing crosswind, we'd all be drifting the same direction. We're not. Correct, Caldwell said. So there's more than one wind event happening in the canyon. Is that your assessment? Chen hesitated. Yes, sir. Then make the appropriate adjustments and take your position. Chen looked at the canyon, back at Caldwell, back at the canyon. Then he took his position, and Caldwell watched him try to calculate something he didn't have enough information to fully calculate and fire and miss. Caldwell said nothing, because this was the lesson. The lesson was not that they were bad shooters. They were extraordinary shooters. The lesson was that extraordinary wasn't enough when the environment contained more variables than your data collection method could detect. And the lesson required the frustration. It required the humiliation of the miss. It required the moment of genuine confusion to make the revelation when it finally came land with the weight it deserved. But by the 12th operator, something was changing in the atmosphere of the range that Caldwell hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was looking for blame. He heard it in fragments. In the sotto voce exchanges that operators had when they believed they were out of earshot but weren't. Wind flags are wrong. The placement is wrong. These instruments aren't calibrated correctly. Nobody can hit this with bad data. Maybe the target itself is set at the wrong distance. Somebody check the rangefinder. And then from one operator whose name he didn't immediately place something more direct. This is a rigged evaluation. Nobody's supposed to hit it. That's the point. They want to see how we respond to failure. Caldwell turned toward the voice. The operator who'd spoken, a heavy-set staff sergeant named Bauman with a face that broadcast everything he was thinking, held his gaze for exactly half a second, and then found something very interesting to look at on the ground near his left boot. Bauman, Caldwell said. Sir. Do you believe this evaluation is rigged? A pause. No, sir. Then stop speculating about things you don't understand and focus on the problem in front of you. He said it calmly. He always said these things calmly. But what happened next surprised him. Rig Sergeant Dominic Reeves, who had been the first shooter on the canyon course and whose face had carried a tightly controlled frustration all morning, spoke up. Colonel, with respect, we've had 16 attempts on this target. 0 confirmed impacts. Every adjustment we've made has produced an unpredictable result. We are working with data that we can observe, and we are still failing. Something is wrong with our information. Caldwell looked at him. Are you suggesting, Caldwell said carefully, that the fault lies with the range rather than the shooters? Reeves held his ground. I'm suggesting that we are not getting accurate feedback from what we can observe, sir. Which means either our instruments are compromised or the environment contains conditions we haven't been briefed on. Your instruments are not compromised. Then we haven't been briefed on something. The range went very quiet. And in that quiet, Colonel Ethan Caldwell felt for the first time in a very long time the subtle and deeply unwelcome sensation of a situation that was developing in a direction he had not fully planned for. He had expected frustration. He had expected confusion. He had designed for both. He had not designed for 16 consecutive misses, creating a collective revolt in confidence that was now starting to look less like productive challenge and more like a breakdown in the group's belief in the exercise itself. He opened his mouth to respond, and that was when he heard the sound of boots on gravel, coming from behind him, coming from the direction of the main gate. He turned. Maya Voss was walking back onto his range. She wasn't running. She wasn't being escorted by anyone with authority to bring her back. She was walking the same way she had been walking when she arrived, quietly, deliberately, with the worn rifle case held easily in her left hand, and her eyes already on the canyon, reading something in it that she had apparently been reading since the moment she first arrived. Vasquez was not beside her. Instead, walking 3 steps behind her, and to her left, was a figure in a flight suit that Caldwell recognized before he had consciously processed the rank insignia. Rear Admiral James Whitfield, Commander Naval Special Warfare Command. He had arrived on a helicopter that Caldwell had not heard from a direction he had not been watching with a woman he had personally removed from this range 45 minutes ago. And the look on Admiral Whitfield's face was not anger. It was something much, much worse. It was patience. The kind of patience that belongs to someone who has already seen exactly how this moment was going to unfold, and has simply been waiting for the appropriate scene to arrive. Caldwell stood completely still. The operators behind him had gone so quiet that he could hear the canyon wind. Admiral Whitfield stopped 6 feet in front of him and said with absolute calm, "Colonel Caldwell." "Admiral," Caldwell said. He kept his voice level. He was very good at that. "I believe you've met Commander Voss." Caldwell said nothing. "She designed this range evaluation," Whitfield said. "She designed the canyon course. She selected the target placement, the wind flag positions, and the environmental parameters specifically, because of what this terrain does to a shooter who is working with incomplete observational data." He paused. "She also was not on your pre-coordination roster because her participation in this evaluation is classified at a level that your operations staff does not have access to. Her credentials were valid. Her access was legitimate. And she was removed from this range by you personally in front of 40 operators without the documentation or the authority to do so." The silence on the range had a different quality now. It wasn't the silence of people watching a difficult moment. It was the silence of people trying not to react to a devastating one. Caldwell looked at Maya Voss. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the canyon, still reading it. Whatever she was seeing out there, she had apparently decided it was more immediately interesting than the conversation that was currently dismantling his professional standing. "Commander Voss," Whitfield said. Maya turned. "Admiral." "Whenever you're ready." She looked at Caldwell for a moment. Her expression carried nothing he could identify as triumph. Nothing that looked like vindication. It was something else. Something that in the space of a breath he recognized as the specific and disquieting look of someone who felt genuinely sorry for him. "Colonel," she said, "I'd like your permission to address your operators." He could have said no. He knew that. His range. His authority still technically intact, however bruised. He could have escalated. Could have demanded a formal process. Could have pushed back in 15 different ways that his rank gave him access to. He looked at her. He looked at the canyon where 17 of the finest shooters in the military had failed to hit a target that apparently this woman had specifically designed to expose exactly the kind of thinking that had governed his range for 31 years. "Permission granted," he said. And Maya Voss set down her rifle case, opened it slowly, and walked to the firing line. Maya Voss walked to the firing line, the way she walked everywhere, without announcement, without ceremony, without any visible awareness of the 41 pairs of eyes tracking her every movement. She set the rifle case down beside the shooting position, crouched, and unlatched it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed that exact motion in conditions far less forgiving than this. Nobody spoke. Caldwell stood 6 feet behind the line arms at his sides and watched. His face gave nothing away. That was the only thing he still had full control over in this moment. The architecture of his expression, and he was using it the way a man uses a wall when everything else has already given way. Admiral Whitfield had stepped back. Not far. Just enough to make it clear that what happened at the firing line now belonged to Maya, not to him. That deliberate withdrawal communicated more than any formal introduction could have. This woman didn't need a handler. She didn't need a warm-up act. Whatever was about to happen, she had done it before, and she had done it in places where the stakes were measured in human lives rather than evaluation scores. Maya lifted the rifle from the case. It was not what any of them expected. The operators on the line had spent the morning handling precision instruments that represented the current apex of military manufacturing, sophisticated, expensive, temperature-compensated systems that cost more than most people earned in a year. What Maya pulled from that worn canvas case looked like it belonged in a different era. A bolt-action long rifle, heavily customized, but clearly not new, with a stock that had been refinished at least once, and a scope mount that showed the kind of minor scarring that came from real-world use in demanding environments. It was a working tool. It looked like it had worked very hard for a very long time. Sergeant Major Hollister, standing 3 feet to Caldwell's left, made the smallest possible sound under his breath. Not quite a word. more like the involuntary exhale of someone recalibrating an assumption they'd held without realizing they were holding it. Maya didn't explain the rifle. She didn't explain anything yet. She settled into the shooting position with an economy of motion that was almost unsettling to watch. No adjustment period, no preliminary fidgeting, no visible process of getting comfortable. She simply went from standing to positioned, and then she was still, and the stillness was absolute. She looked through the scope at the canyon target for a long time. Nobody timed it, but it felt like minutes. Then she stood back up, stepped away from the position, and turned to face the operators. "Who made the last shot on this target?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then Captain Marlena Ford raised her hand slightly. "I did." "Where did it go?" "Low and left of center, about 16 inches at estimated distance." "What adjustment did you make from your previous shot?" Ford pulled out her data book. "I added 1.25 MOA right elevation, half MOA windage correction, right based on the flag reading at position 3. Maya looked at her steadily. "And where did the shot before that go?" "High right." "So you corrected right from high right and ended up low left?" "Yes." "Does that make sense to you?" Ford's jaw tightened fractionally. "No, it doesn't." "Good," Maya said. "That's the first honest thing anyone said out loud since this evaluation started." She let that land for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at the rest of the operators. "How many of you believe your instruments are giving you accurate data right now?" Silence. "Raise your hand if you believe your instruments are accurate." 3 hands went up. Then 2 of those hands came down when the people they belonged to appeared to reconsider the implicit cost of being wrong. 1 hand stayed up. It belonged to Bauman, the same staff sergeant who had suggested the evaluation was rigged. He held his hand up with the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided that consistency was a form of dignity. Maya looked at him. "What's your name?" "Bauman, ma'am, Staff Sergeant." "Why do you think your instruments are accurate, Bauman?" "Because I calibrated them this morning at 0600, and I trust my calibration." "Your calibration is fine," she said. "Your instruments are reading the environment correctly. The problem is that the environment you're reading isn't the environment that's touching your bullet." She paused. "Your bullet doesn't travel through the wind at position 3. Position 3 is where your flag is. Your bullet travels through 940 meters of air that contains at minimum 3 distinct wind events, only one of which is visible from this position." Bauman slowly lowered his hand. Maya turned toward the canyon and was quiet for a moment. When she turned back, something had shifted in her delivery, not softer exactly, but more direct. Less instructional, more personal. "I've been watching this range for the past 45 minutes, she said. "From outside the fence line, I counted 16 attempts on this target. I watched every shot, I watched every adjustment, and what I saw wasn't failure of skill." She looked across the line. "Every one of you is technically capable of hitting that target. The problem is, you've been trying to solve a 3-variable problem with a 1-variable solution. You read 1 wind you fire for 1 wind, and then you're confused when the round doesn't go where 1 wind would take it." Reeves spoke up. He'd been quiet since his exchange with Caldwell earlier, but the restraint had apparently reached its limit. "Ma'am, with respect, if we can't read the other wind events from this position, how are we supposed to compensate for them?" "You're not," Maya said. Reeves stared at her. "We're not. Not individually. You're supposed to figure out how to collect data that you can't collect alone." She looked at him directly. "That's what this course is testing. Not whether you can hit a target. Whether you understand that sometimes you need someone in a different position to tell you what you can't see from where you're standing." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had preceded it that morning. It had a quality that Caldwell recognized from moments in his career that he still thought about years later, the silence that precedes understanding. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of something clicking into alignment. He didn't like that the click was happening because of her and not because of him. He didn't like it, but he felt it the same way everyone else did. Chin, the youngest operator on the line, leaned forward slightly. You're saying the solution is a spotter on the other side of the canyon. I'm saying the solution requires information from a position you don't currently have covered. Maya's eyes moved to him. Whether that means a forward spotter, a different observational tool, or a communication with someone who has already scouted that terrain, the solution is collaborative. It's not individual. The course didn't provide us with a forward position, Ford said. There was something in her voice, not resentment, but the careful tone of someone who was beginning to understand that the ground had shifted under their feet and was checking where solid footing still existed. No, Maya agreed. It didn't. Because the test isn't about whether you can use the resources you're given. It's about whether you recognize when the resources you've been given are insufficient and what you do about that recognition. She looked at Caldwell. He held her gaze. Permission to proceed with demonstration, she asked. Proceed, he said. The word came out level. He was still very good at that. She went back to the firing position. What happened next was something that Caldwell would replay in his mind for a long time afterward, not because it was technically impossible, it wasn't, but because of the quality of attention it required, and what that quality of attention revealed about the difference between someone who understood their craft and someone who had merely mastered its procedures. Maya did not fire immediately. She spent 4 minutes in position without firing. 4 minutes of visible active observation, the scope moved fractionally but deliberately across multiple points of the canyon. Her right hand wasn't on the trigger. It was moving slightly, her fingers adjusting the elevation turret in small increments, then returning, then adjusting again. She was building something. Not rushing it. Building it. Hollister had produced a timer without being asked. Old habit. He held it but didn't start it. At 4 minutes and approximately 20 seconds. Maya fired. The sound of the shot was still rolling back off the canyon walls when Hollister's radio crackled. The remote camera unit positioned near the target transmitted its feed to the range tablet in his hand. Dead center. Not close to center. Dead center. The kind of impact that didn't invite interpretation, it simply was what it was. Nobody on the line made a sound for 2 full seconds. Then Chen said quietly and involuntarily, "How?" Maya worked the bolt, chambered a second round, adjusted the turret, 2 clicks, fired, dead center again. Third round, 1 click adjustment, fire. The feed on Hollister's tablet showed 3 impacts so close together that at range camera resolution they almost read as one. Bowman made a sound that was not language. Ford turned and looked at Reeves, and Reeves's expression had moved past professional neutrality into something that looked plainly, and without disguise, like awe. Maya stood up from the position. She ejected the partial magazine, safed the weapon, and turned back to the line. 3 variables, she said. Surface wind from the northwest at approximately 12 miles per hour. Reverse canyon draft from the east wall running counter at 6 to 8. Thermal column off the south-facing rock at approximately 400 meters depth, running vertical and deflecting incoming rounds upward before they descend to target level. She paused. You have to compensate for all 3 simultaneously. You also have to know which one is dominant at the moment of the trigger break, because that changes depending on time of day and temperature. How do you know the thermal column is at 400 meters? Ford asked. She was writing now. Her data book was open, and she was writing fast. Because I spent 6 months on a range with similar terrain geometry in another country, and I learned it wrong the same way you did today before I learned it right. Maya looked at her. There's no shortcut to that data. You have to get it wrong enough times in conditions that matter before your brain starts asking the right questions. What are the right questions? Chen asked. When a shot goes wrong, the right question isn't what did I do incorrectly. She paused. The right question is what did I fail to see? There's a difference. One puts the failure inside you, the other puts it in the environment where it actually lives. Caldwell listened to this. I understood in the specific and uncomfortable way that intelligent people understand things that are simultaneously true and personally inconvenient, that she was not just talking about shooting. She was talking about him, not loudly. Not with any theatrical gesture toward the irony of a man who had removed her from his range now standing in the audience of her instruction. She wasn't performing anything. She was simply saying a true thing in a context that made its application to his behavior this morning unavoidable. He had asked himself when he'd dismissed her, "What did I do incorrectly?" He had not asked, "What did I fail to see?" The distinction landed in his chest with a weight that had nothing to do with professional embarrassment and everything to do with recognition. He pushed it down. He wasn't ready for it yet. But he felt where it was. Hollister stepped to his side and said very quietly, "Sir, she designed this course." "I know that." "She designed the target placement to produce exactly what we saw this morning. Every miss. Every bad adjustment. She built the course to teach the lesson she just taught." "I know that, Hollister." A brief pause. "She also didn't say a word about being removed from the range, sir. Not to the Admiral, not to the operators. She hasn't mentioned it." Caldwell looked at him. Hollister's face was perfectly composed. He was simply conveying information. That was all. Caldwell looked back at the firing line where Maya was now working with Ford on data notation, her voice quiet and direct, and entirely focused on the shooter in front of her. The thing about being very good at projecting authority was that you became over time dependent on the projection. Not intentionally, not lazily, but the posture became the reality, and eventually you stopped being able to distinguish between the weight of your rank and the weight of what you actually knew. They merged, and the merge felt like completeness, like mastery. What Caldwell was watching at the firing line was someone for whom those things had never merged because they didn't need to. Her authority didn't come from her rank. It came from a relationship with difficulty that had been built specifically and expensively through repetition, in conditions that didn't offer the option of being wrong. She hadn't been posturing this morning when she absorbed his dismissal without resistance. She hadn't been calculating. She hadn't been patient in a strategic sense. She had simply not needed to fight about it, because whatever he said or didn't say about her right to be on this range had no effect on what she knew, what she could do, and what she was going to do when the moment was right. That was not a posture. That was something else entirely. Riggs approached him, not quickly, not with the energy of someone bringing a problem. He stopped beside Caldwell, and for a moment they both watched the firing line without speaking. Then Riggs said, "She's the one, sir, isn't she?" "The one what?" "The one who designed the evaluation. The one who's supposed to be selecting the team." He paused. "The one the mission brief refers to as the course architect." Caldwell said nothing. "She's been in the classified appendix this whole time," Riggs said. "I saw it 3 weeks ago, and I didn't put together the name. Voss, I should have." Another pause. "Her record is—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. "I've never seen a record like that, sir, not in 20 years. "Then you should get back to the line," Caldwell said, "and make sure she knows you understand that." Riggs looked at him for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not respect exactly, but the recognition that what Caldwell had just said cost him something, and that the cost was being absorbed voluntarily. "Yes, sir," Riggs said, and returned to the line. Caldwell stayed where he was and continued watching. Over the next 2 hours, Maya did something he had not seen done on his range in 31 years of operating it. She rebuilt the entire framework of how those operators understood the canyon problem, not by explaining it at them, not by lecturing in the way that instruction so often becomes performance, but by asking questions that made them build the answer themselves. She put Ford in one position and Chen 50 yards away in another, and had them talk to each other through a data transmission that simulated forward spotter communication. She had Reeves adjust his dope based on Ford's observation from a different angle. She had Baumann track the thermal column timing with a simple temperature sensor and call out the intervals at which it peaked. Then she had them shoot. Reeves hit the target on the first attempt. He stood up from the position and turned and looked at the impact confirmation on Hollister's tablet, and for a moment his face was completely unguarded. No professional composure. Just a man who had spent a morning failing at something and had just understood why, and the understanding felt physical. "That's it," he said, not loudly, to himself mostly. That's what it was. Ford hit on the second attempt. Chen on the first. Okafor on the second. Even Bauman, who had declared his instruments trustworthy and held his hand up in the face of skepticism, hit the target on his second shot, and when he did, he laughed a short, involuntary sound and then composed himself immediately and said quietly, "She was right." Nobody asked who he meant. By early afternoon, 23 of the 40 operators had hit the canyon target. Not all of them. Not yet. But 23 who had been failing all morning under one framework were succeeding under another. The framework was not better equipment. The framework was not a different calculation method. The framework was, what do I need that I don't currently have, and how do I get it from the people around me? Caldwell had been running his range on a different framework for 31 years. His framework was identify the best individual. Measure against a fixed standard. Separate those who make the standard from those who do not. He had built careers on that framework. He had built his range on it. He had built his identity as a trainer on it, and watching the 23rd operator hit the canyon target by trusting the operator beside him rather than the instrument in front of him. Caldwell felt the framework crack. Not collapse, not disappear, just crack. The way material cracks when the stress it was designed to handle exceeds the original specification. He was still standing there working out what to do with that crack when Admiral Whitfield appeared at his shoulder. Whitfield didn't speak immediately. They watched the firing line together for a moment. Then Whitfield said, "She asked me not to contact your operations center in advance." Caldwell looked at him. She said if the course architect was on the roster and pre-coordinated, the operators would look for her as a resource. She wanted to see if they would look for resources that weren't offered to them. Whitfield paused. She also said she wanted to arrive like any other walk-on because the way she was received would tell her something important about the range culture. A long pause opened between them. "And did it," Caldwell said. It wasn't quite a question. She said to tell you, and these were her words, that what she observed was a man who has built a training environment that produces exactly the behavior this mission cannot afford. Caldwell absorbed that. Meaning, Whitfield said carefully, that the operators who came here are afraid to admit incomplete information. They're afraid to say, "I don't know." They've been trained to perform certainty, even when certainty isn't available. He paused. She believes that's a product of this range's culture, your culture. The crack widened. She also said, Whitfield continued, and now his voice carried something that wasn't censure, but wasn't sympathy either. Something more precise than both, that she's seen that culture save lives in situations where individual capability was the determining factor. She's not dismissing what you've built here, Colonel. She's saying it has a limitation that this particular mission is going to test directly. Caldwell watched Maya across the range. She was with Chen, now crouched beside him, pointing at something in the canyon that she apparently wanted him to find without being told what it was. "What mission?" Caldwell said. Whitfield looked at him. "That's the other conversation, and it's not one we have on an open range." He paused. "But I'll tell you this much. The team she selects today is going for someone who is running out of time. And the skills she's evaluating have nothing to do with what your range tests for." Caldwell said nothing. "She needs people who can adapt," Whitfield said. "People who can work with incomplete data. People who can trust someone else's read when their own read isn't enough." He paused. "People who can say I was wrong and make the next decision without carrying the weight of the last one." Caldwell looked at him directly for the first time since the conversation had started. "Are you telling me I should ask to be on that team?" Whitfield held his gaze for a moment. "I'm telling you she asked specifically about your shooting record this morning, before she got out of the helicopter." He let that sit. "She didn't ask about anyone else's record, just yours." He walked back toward the range. Caldwell stood alone. He looked at the canyon. At the course target he had placed 940 meters away, because he knew what the wind did there, because he had learned it over years, because this range was his knowledge made physical, and because he understood now he had been using that knowledge as a gate rather than a gift. He had been testing people against what he knew. He had never once considered testing them or himself against what he didn't. Across the range, Maya was standing again. She had Chen on his feet. both of them looking at the canyon, and whatever she was saying had his full attention. She wasn't watching Caldwell. She wasn't tracking the conversation that had just happened. She was completely absorbed in the problem in front of her, in the operator, beside her in the canyon and its variables, and the team she was building one conversation at a time. That was the other thing Caldwell finally understood, standing there with the weight of his own framework cracking around him. She wasn't doing any of this to prove a point. She wasn't here to correct him. She wasn't here to demonstrate his inadequacy. She was here because someone was trapped in a mountainous region with a running clock, and she needed a team that could make impossible shots in conditions nobody had pre-briefed, and she had spent the day building that team, the only way she knew how, by creating the conditions that revealed who those people actually were. His range had been part of the design. His dismissal of her had been part of the data, and she had already moved past both of them. The crack in his framework spread to its edges, and Ethan Caldwell stood inside it and tried to figure out who he was going to be on the other side. Caldwell was still standing in the same spot when Maya walked over to him. She didn't approach with the energy of someone preparing a confrontation. She walked the way she did everything with that particular economy that he had now spent enough hours observing to recognize as a signature. No wasted motion. No performance. She stopped 3 feet from him and looked at the canyon for a moment before she looked at him as if she was finishing one thought before starting another. "You have a question," she said. It wasn't phrased as a question. It was an observation. Caldwell looked at her. "Several. Ask the one that's bothering you most." He considered the options. Then he said, "How long were you planning to stay outside the fence line if I hadn't been interrupted?" Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. "As long as it took." "That could have been all day." "It could have been all week," she said simply. "I've waited longer for worse reasons." He absorbed that. "And if I had never been told who you were, if the Admiral's helicopter had been delayed, then I would have watched the evaluation end, confirmed my read on the team composition, and filed my assessment through the classified channel that was always available to me." She paused. "Your removal of me from the range was inconvenient. It wasn't operationally significant." That landed harder than he expected. Not because it was cruel, she wasn't delivering it cruelly. Because it was accurate, and accuracy about the irrelevance of your own authority has a particular kind of bite. "You designed this course to produce failure," he said. "I designed it to produce information. The failure was already there. I just built a context that made it visible." "Visible to whom?" "To me," she said. "And eventually to them." She nodded toward the firing line where Reeves and Ford were still working the canyon course, talking to each other in the shorthand that operators develop when they've stopped performing competence and started actually sharing it. "And apparently to you." Caldwell looked at her directly. "Admiral Whitfield said you asked about my shooting record." "I did." "Why?" She turned to face him fully. Her eyes had the quality of someone who was deciding not how much to reveal, but how directly to reveal it. "Because the mission has a position that requires a specific capability, and the record suggests you have it. The question is whether you're willing to use it under someone else's command structure." The air between them went still. "You're considering putting me on the team," he said. "I'm considering it. I removed you from my range this morning. You did. I did it publicly in front of 40 operators without due process. You did that too." He held her gaze. "And you're still considering it." "Colonel." Her voice was level, but something in it had dropped a register quieter, more direct, the tone of someone who was going to say a true thing and wanted it received as a true thing and not as a performance of one. "I've been in situations where the person who made my life difficult in the morning was the person I needed covering my position by afternoon. I don't select teams based on how people treat me. I select them based on what they can do when everything goes wrong." A long pause. "What can I do?" he said. Not defensively, genuinely. "The shot I need has a specific geometry," she said. "Canyon terrain, extreme elevation differential, multi-layer wind environment. The target will be dynamic, not static. The window will be less than 4 seconds." She paused. "Your range record over the last 3 years shows you can make that shot." What your record doesn't tell me is whether you can make it when you're not the one calling the conditions. Caldwell felt the precision of that statement, the way you feel a blade, not violently, but with an awareness of its edge. You're asking if I can take orders. I'm asking if you can trust someone else's read over your own in a moment where your own read feels more reliable. She held his gaze. Those are different questions, and most people get them confused. Before he could respond, Hollister was moving toward them at a pace that communicated urgency without running. He stopped beside Caldwell and said quietly and directly, "Sir, we have an encrypted transmission from the operations center. Priority level requires your immediate presence." Caldwell looked at Maya. She was already looking toward the operations building. Something in her posture had shifted, not dramatically, but in the way a person shifts when a clock. "They've been monitoring internally, just moved to the next interval." "How long has the transmission been waiting?" she asked Hollister. 14 minutes, ma'am. It was routed through the classified channel and flagged for Commander Voss by name, sir. But our operations center couldn't reach her directly because—" He paused. "Because my credentials weren't in your system," she finished. "Walk with me." They moved toward the operations building. All three of them, and Caldwell felt the evaluation behind him recede into a different category of event. Not concluded, but superseded by something that had been running parallel to it the entire time. Inside the operations center, the communications officer, a young lieutenant named Park, had the encrypted feed isolated on the secure terminal. He vacated the seat without being asked when Maya entered. She sat down, keyed her personal decryption credential, and read. Caldwell watched her face. He had become, over the course of this day, a student of her face in the way that people become students of faces that tell them important things without announcing them. She was not easy to read, but she was not. He was learning completely opaque. There were small indicators, a tightening around the jaw, a slowing of the blink rate, a quality of attention that sharpened and then deliberately re-steadied itself. He saw all three of those things happen in sequence as she read the transmission. She finished. She read it a second time. Then she sat back and looked at the wall for exactly 3 seconds before turning to face them. "The timeline moved," she said. Hollister and Park looked at her. Caldwell said, "How far?" "Extraction window was 72 hours from yesterday's brief. It's now 31. She pulled up a secondary screen. The team that was supposed to be the primary extraction asset, Bravo element, hit a vehicle IED on the access road 4 hours ago. 2 operators are non-mobile. The rest are tactically compromised. She was already pulling up map data on the classified system, her fingers moving with the specific speed of someone who has spent years working on screens where speed was not efficiency, but survival. This evaluation just became the mission. The room went quiet, in a way that was fundamentally different from every other silence Caldwell had experienced that day. The silence on the range had been professional discomfort. This was operational weight. These were different things in the same way that a photograph of a fire is different from a fire. Park said, "Ma'am, is JSOC aware of the timeline change?" JSOC generated the transmission. She looked up. "They're asking for my team composition within 2 hours and mission-ready status within 6. Hollister made the sound again, the involuntary exhale of someone whose internal calculation just produced a number they weren't ready for. Caldwell stepped forward. "Who's downrange?" Maya looked at him. In another context, at another moment, she might have measured the question against access levels and need-to-know parameters. She didn't. "Chief Petty Officer Daniel Rourke," she said. "He's been forward for 11 days on a separate intelligence operation. The extraction plan was designed for a 72-hour window with Bravo element as the primary asset." A pause. "Danny's been under my command for 4 years. The last sentence was not operational information. It was something else. Caldwell understood what it was. "How bad is the position?" he said. "He's mobile. He's concealed. His communication window is limited to 2 brief transmissions per day because of the SIGINT environment." She pulled up the terrain overlay. "The extraction point is here. To get him out, we need suppressive precision coverage on 3 separate elevated positions simultaneously. The geometry means the shots require 3 independent firing positions across a ridgeline, all within a 4-second window. She looked at Caldwell. "The canyon course," he said. "The canyon course was the easy version," she said. "The ridgeline has 4 wind variables. The distance on the hardest shot is over 1,100 meters. The elevation differential is significant." "How significant?" "The shooter on position 3 will be firing downhill at approximately 22 degrees. Caldwell didn't respond immediately. He was doing what any serious shooter does when confronted with a technical specification, running it against his own experience, finding the edges of it, identifying where his data was solid and where it became inference. 22 degrees downhill at 1,100 meters with 4 wind variables and a 4-second window. He had made harder shots. He was fairly certain he had made that exact shot in different terrain, under different pressure. The difference was he had been the one calling the conditions. Maya was still watching him. She saw the calculation happening, and she didn't interrupt it. "Who's in the other 2 positions?" he said. "Reeves on position 1, Ford on position 2. She paused. "Both of whom spent this morning missing the canyon target and this afternoon learning why." "And position 3. She held his gaze. "Me," he said. "If you're willing." The room held its breath. Park was looking at the screen. Hollister was looking at Caldwell. Caldwell said, "You need an answer now." "I need an answer before I file team composition with JSOC in 2 hours, she said. "So no, not right this second." "You'll have it in 20 minutes, he said. He walked out of the operations center. He walked to the edge of the range to the position where he had stood all morning, and he looked at the canyon. The canyon that he had designed. The canyon that he had spent 31 years knowing better than anyone on this range. The canyon that today had turned out to contain things he hadn't seen. He thought about Rourke. He didn't know the man. He didn't need to. He knew what 11 days in a compromised forward position felt like, and he knew what a running clock felt like, and he knew what it felt like to have your extraction window cut in half while you were sitting in the field with no ability to affect the decision. He thought about the shot. 22 degrees, 1,100 meters, 4 variables, 4 seconds. He thought about Maya's question, the real one, underneath the tactical specifications, whether he could take a call from someone else in the moment when his own call felt more reliable. And he thought about something she'd said on the range hours ago to the operators who had been failing at the canyon target. When a shot goes wrong, the right question isn't what did I do incorrectly? The right question is what did I fail to see? He had failed to see a woman who knew more about this range than he did because she was standing at the entrance with a worn rifle case and no visible rank. And he had looked at what was visible and made a judgment based entirely on what he already knew. He had asked himself the wrong question all morning. He had asked, "Does she belong here?" He had never asked, "What is she here to do?" 18 minutes after he walked out of the operations center, he walked back in. Maya was at the secure terminal. She looked up. "Position 3, he said. "I'm in." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and turned back to the terminal. "I'll have your mission package ready in 40 minutes, she said. "Reeves and Ford are already briefed. Hollister is coordinating transport." She paused. "One thing. Say it. On that ridgeline, I'm the mission commander, not by courtesy, not by arrangement. My call is the call." She looked at him directly. "If I tell you to hold, you hold. If I tell you to fire, you fire. If I tell you your read is wrong, you trust my read until the evidence says otherwise." He had known this was coming. He had known it in the operations building. He had known it if he was honest from the moment Whitfield had told him she'd asked about his shooting record. "Understood," he said. She studied him for the moment longer than the word required. "You don't like it?" "No." "But you'll do it?" "Yes." "Why?" The question surprised him. He looked at her. "Because someone is running out of time downrange and you need the shot and I can make it." A pause. "And because I have been running this range for 31 years under the assumption that the most important variable in any high-stakes situation is the individual at the trigger." He held her gaze. "Today was the first day I had reason to question that assumption." I'd rather question it on a live operation than spend another 31 years finding out I was wrong. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically. But the thing that had been careful and measured and professionally neutral for most of the day relaxed fractionally in the specific way that things relax when a risk resolves. She turned back to the terminal. Mission brief in 40 minutes. Don't be late. He wasn't late. The briefing room held 7 people. Maya Caldwell Reeves Ford, and 3 additional operators who would form the ground element, moving, covering, extracting. Hollister ran the logistics board. Park managed the communications overlay. Maya stood at the front of the room and gave the brief the way Caldwell had always believed a brief should be given, without wasted language, without the theatrical seriousness that junior officers sometimes mistook for gravity, with the specific and technical focus of someone who had lived inside this plan long enough to know where its weaknesses were. She knew where they were because she had built the plan. And she described the weaknesses before anyone asked about them, which told the room something important about how she led. The target was an extraction point on a ridgeline in a mountainous region that Caldwell recognized from previous operational contexts without being able to say so openly. The route in was a 4-kilometer approach on foot from a vehicle drop point. The shooting positions were pre-scouted via satellite imagery position. 1 on a rock outcropping at the northern end of the ridge position. 2 behind a natural berm, at the midpoint position. 3. Caldwell's at the southern terminus, elevated above the other 2, with the downhill geometry that made it technically the most demanding shot and positionally the most exposed. Position 3 is the shot that ends the engagement, Maya said. She didn't look at Caldwell specifically when she said it. She didn't need to. The suppressive fire from 1 and 2 creates the 4-second window. The shot from 3 closes the threat that's been preventing extraction. She paused. If position 3 is late even by 1 second, the window closes and the geometry changes. We do not get a second attempt. Reeves said, and Rourke's position during the window. He'll be moving on my signal. His route takes him through the open for approximately 40 meters before he hits cover. She let the room sit with that number. 40 meters of open ground. Every operator in the room understood what that meant without having it explained. He's fast. He knows the terrain, but 40 meters is 40 meters. Ford said, what's the threat element on the high ground? 3 confirmed, possibly 4. They've been static on that ridgeline for 6 hours, which means they're either waiting for movement or they've been posted there as a deliberate ambush element. She pulled up the satellite imagery overlay. The static positioning is actually helpful for us. Static targets with known positions are manageable. What we cannot have is one of those 3 going mobile before we're established and ready. And if one goes mobile before the window, Reeves asked. Then we adapt, Maya said. Which is why I selected this team. Caldwell watched the room process that. The phrase carried weight that a month ago he might have categorized as motivational language, the kind of thing commanders said before difficult operations to settle their people. He understood now that it wasn't motivation. It was a technical description. She had selected them because she had watched them adapt today in real time under the specific pressure she had designed to test exactly that capacity. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes. By the end of it, Caldwell had the mission in his body the way experienced operators carry missions, not as a plan to be executed, but as a set of contingencies to be navigated with decision points at each interval where the plan and the reality would be compared, and one of them would need to yield. He had always believed up to this day that the plan should be solid enough that reality yielded. I was beginning to understand that the better operators believed the opposite. After the room cleared, Maya was the last one out. Caldwell fell in beside her without asking. They walked toward the equipment staging area in silence for a moment. Then he said, Rourke, how long have you known him? I ran my first SEAL qualification with his class, she said. He was my swim buddy for the water phase. A brief pause. He's been telling anyone who would listen for 5 years that I'm the best shooter he's ever worked with. I've been telling him he has terrible taste in role models. It was the most personal thing she'd said to him all day. It landed like something real, not the professional biography of a legendary operator, but the texture of an actual relationship. Two people who had been in the water together and come out the other side with the kind of loyalty that doesn't require explanation. "He knows you're coming," Caldwell said. "He knows an extraction team is coming. He doesn't know the composition." She paused. "He'll know when he hears the first shot from position 1. He's worked with Reeves before. He'll recognize the cadence. And when he hears position 3. She was quiet for a moment. "He'll know it's not Bravo element. The shot geometry will tell him that." "Will he trust it?" She looked at him. "He'll trust it because I'll have already given him my personal authentication code in the transmission window. He'll know I cleared the team." Another pause. "He's been in that position for 11 days, Colonel. He trusts me. He's going to come out of cover on my signal and run 40 meters of open ground because I told him to. That's the part of this operation that doesn't have a contingency." The weight of that settled over Caldwell completely. 40 meters. On her word. On 11 days of waiting, and a 4-second window, and a shot from a position he'd be occupying for the first time on a live operation. "You trust Reeves," he said. "You trust Ford." "Yes." "Do you trust me?" She stopped walking. He stopped with her. She looked at him with the same steady measuring quality she'd had since the moment she turned to face him in the staging area this morning, before he'd said a word, before he'd removed her from the range, before any of it. Just that look. Patient and precise. "I trust your shot," she said. "I trust your record. I trust what I watched you absorb today." A pause. "The rest I'm going to find out on the ridgeline." He nodded. "Fair. It's the best I can offer." "It's enough," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized him. Not the colonel. Not the man who had removed her from his range. The man who was standing in the equipment staging area at the end of a day that had cracked him open, saying, "It's enough," to an answer that 2 weeks ago he would have found insulting. "Gear up," she said. "We move in 3 hours." She walked away. Caldwell stood in the staging area and looked at the equipment laid out in front of him, his rifle, his optics, his kit, and felt for the first time in a very long time the specific and clarifying sensation of not being entirely sure what he was capable of. Not because he doubted his skill, because he was about to test it inside someone else's framework. And the most honest thing he could say to himself in the quiet of the staging area, with 3 hours left before they moved, was that he didn't know how that felt yet. He was going to find out. He started pulling on his kit. Behind him, through the operations center window, he could see Maya at the secure terminal running one final check on the transmission window, timing the contact interval for Rourke's next scheduled communication building. Her plan to the last possible detail before the moment arrived when planning ended and the ridgeline began. 11 days in the field. 40 meters of open ground. 4 seconds. 1 shot. Caldwell picked up his rifle, checked it, and got ready to be something he hadn't been in 31 years. A shooter who trusted the call. The vehicle dropped them 4 kilometers out and kept moving. No lights. No engine idle. Just a door 4 seconds, and then silence and darkness, and the sound of boots finding ground in the kind of careful quiet that operators learn to produce not through training, but through the accumulated understanding that noise was a decision, and every decision had consequences. 7 people. Moving in a staggered formation that Maya had briefed down to the interval, not because these operators didn't know how to move, but because this terrain had specific characteristics that made the standard formation geometry wrong, and she had scouted the imagery enough times to know where each adjustment needed to happen before they arrived at it. Caldwell was third in the column, behind Reeves ahead of Ford. He had been in this position before, not this terrain, not this mission, but this position. The middle of a column, moving towards something that couldn't be fully known in advance. He knew the physiological signature of it, the heightened peripheral awareness. The way breathing became a managed process rather than an automatic one. The specific quality of attention that narrowed and simultaneously expanded, taking in more information while filtering it more aggressively. He knew all of that. What he didn't know. What was new. Specifically new. In a way he felt as a physical texture, was the experience of moving toward a shot he would take on someone else's signal. Every operation of his career that had involved a trigger, he had been the one reading the conditions. He had been the one deciding when the data was sufficient, when the window was right, when the shot was clear. Even in situations with a spotter, even with a partner reading wind and calling corrections, the fundamental decision now had always lived in him. Tonight it didn't. Tonight now would come through his earpiece in Maya's voice, and he would fire, and the entire architecture of his 31 years would either support that moment or it wouldn't, and he would find out which in real time, with a man's life as the variable. He moved through the dark and felt that knowledge settle into him the way heavy things settle completely without ceremony, displacing everything else. Ahead of him, Reeves moved with the loose limb deficiency of someone who had done this so many times it had become motor memory. Behind him, Ford's footfalls were almost inaudible. The Ground Element 3 operators named Garza Tran and Weston moved parallel on a slightly different azimuth, working toward the extraction point from a lower angle. Maya moved at the front of the column. She moved differently from how she'd moved on the range. On the range, she had the contained stillness of someone conserving energy for precision. Out here, she had a different quality. Alert and fluid, reading the ground and the dark and whatever information the terrain was communicating in the constant low-level exchange that experienced operators maintain with their environment without being aware they're doing it. She stopped the column twice in the first kilometer. No verbal signal, a closed fist raised at shoulder height. Everyone froze. Everyone waited. Both times after 30 to 45 seconds, she moved her hand forward and they continued. Caldwell didn't know what she had heard or seen or felt that stopped her. Neither instance produced a visible threat. But he had been in enough situations to understand that the absence of a visible threat was exactly the point. You stopped because something was wrong. You waited until it wasn't. Then you moved. He trusted the stops. That surprised him. An hour into the approach, Reeves pulled even with him during a brief pause at a terrain feature that required individual navigation. They moved through it side by side, and Reeves said barely above a breath, "You doing all right, Colonel?" "Yes." "First time working under her?" "Yes." A brief pause. "She called me 2 weeks ago. Said she was building a team, and my name was on a short list. Asked me if I could make the canyon shot." He was quiet for a moment. "I told her I was the best canyon shooter in my unit." Caldwell said nothing. "She said she'd heard the same thing about 6 other people, and she'd be the judge." A pause that carried something not quite a laugh, but its cousin. "She was right. I couldn't make the shot this morning. Not until she showed me what I was missing." He paused again. "She knew I couldn't before I got here. She put me on the team anyway." Caldwell looked at him in the dark. "Why?" "Because she said the ability to make the shot was less important than the ability to understand why you're missing it." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "She said the best shooter on this team is not necessarily the one with the best record. It's the one who can stay calibrated when everything around them is telling them they should already know the answer." Ahead of them, Maya's fist came up. They froze. This pause was longer. 90 seconds, maybe more. Caldwell counted his breaths and used the count to keep himself from projecting meaning onto the silence. He didn't know what she was reading. He wasn't in a position to read it himself. So he waited and he held his body still and he trusted the stop. She moved her hand forward. They continued. 2 kilometers out from the extraction point. She halted the column and brought Caldwell, Reeves, and Ford into a tight cluster. Ground Element continued on their separate azimuth. She kept her voice at the absolute minimum viable volume. "Communication window in 11 minutes. I'll make contact with Rourke and confirm his position and readiness. From that point, we are on his schedule, not ours. He knows the patrol patterns, and he'll give me the insertion timing." She looked at each of them. "Shooting positions are 200 meters further. Reeves, you'll establish on the north outcropping first. Ford the berm at center. I want both of you confirmed in position before I make contact." "And position 3, Caldwell said. "You establish with me. I'm going to position 3 with you." He looked at her. "You're not taking a shooting position." My shot is managing Position 3's wind data. You'll be on the trigger. I'll be calling your conditions. He absorbed that. You're giving up a shooting position to be my spotter. I'm giving up a shooting position to make sure Position 3 fires at the right moment with the right data. Her eyes were steady. The shot from 3 is the one that ends it. I'm not leaving it to a calculation you build alone in the dark. I understood. He didn't like it in the specific way he no longer liked his own preference when it conflicted with her logic. Her logic was correct. Position 3 was the hardest shot. Giving him a spotter who could read 4 wind variables in real time was not a luxury. It was the difference between a shot that worked and a shot that didn't. Understood, he said. Reeves and Ford moved to their positions. Maya and Caldwell moved to Position 3. The ridgeline was exactly what the satellite imagery had shown, elevated exposed on the southern face with the angle to the extraction corridor, sitting at the 22-degree downhill geometry she had briefed. The wind at this elevation was immediately apparent, moving in the layered fashion he had spent the day learning to recognize. Surface level one direction, higher up another, and below them in the corridor, something that wouldn't be measurable from here, but that Maya apparently had a method for estimating from the behavior of the other layers. He settled into position. The rifle felt different here. Not in his hands knew it, but in the context. On the range, the rifle was an instrument of demonstration. Here it was a variable in someone's survival. Maya positioned herself to his left and slightly forward where she could observe the corridor without breaking his sight line. She had a spotting scope that she had carried the entire approach without ever making it feel like it was there. Wind at surface, she said, her voice a thread of sound. 8 to 10 northwest, consistent with the briefing. Confirmed, he said. The layer above it is running the other direction. You'll feel it on the stock when you get your position dialed. Don't fight it, let it tell you where it's going and build your dope around it. He was already feeling it. She was right. The way she was right about things, not loudly, not with any quality of I told you so, but simply accurately. His earpiece crackled. Reeves, Position 1 established, ready. Ford, Position 2 established, ready. Maya keyed her transmitter. Then she pulled out the secondary communication device, the one with Rourke's encrypted channel, and held it where she could feel the vibration of a response without making sound. She transmitted. 3 short pulses. Authentication code. Pause. The response came back in 4 pulses. Maya's eyes closed for exactly 1 second. When they opened, something had changed in her face, something that had been held tightly for a long time, had released fractionally like a breath let out after being held underwater. He was alive. He was mobile. He was ready. She keyed the team channel. Contact established. Rourke is in position. Patrol rotation gives us a 12-minute window beginning in approximately 22 minutes. A pause. Positions confirm ready. 1 ready, Reeves said. 2 ready, Ford said. Caldwell said, 3 ready. 22 minutes. The dark was complete around them. The wind moved in its layers. Caldwell lay in position and breathed and let the rifle become part of him, the way it always did, when he had enough time, not gripped but held, not controlled, but incorporated the trigger guard, becoming an extension of his finger's awareness, rather than a mechanical object. He thought about Rourke. I thought about a man he had never met, lying somewhere below them in the dark, having spent 11 days maintaining the particular discipline of forward positions, rationing everything, sleeping in intervals, managing the specific and exhausting alertness of someone who understood that the moment they stopped paying attention was the moment the situation ended badly. 11 days. And now he was 22 minutes from a signal that would ask him to trust a team he couldn't see. Making shots he couldn't hear coming and run 40 meters of open ground on the word of a woman who had once been his swim buddy in qualification training. The trust required for that was not the professional trust of chain of command. It was something older, something built in water and cold and exhaustion, and the specific knowledge of who a person was when everything else was stripped away. Caldwell thought about the kind of trust he had extended to people in 31 years. He had trusted his operators to meet the standard he set. He had trusted his range to reveal who was ready and who wasn't. He had trusted his own judgment to separate capability from performance. He had never trusted someone else's read over his own in a moment that mattered. He was about to. 15 minutes into the wait, Maya said very quietly without looking at him. "Your first long-range operational shot. What was it?" He looked at her. It was an unexpected question. Not tactical, personal. 830 meters, he said. Desert. Conventional wind, one layer predictable. I had 6 minutes to establish. Were you scared? He considered the question seriously. No, I was focused. There's a difference. I know. A pause. Are you scared now? He held the question against what was actually happening in his body. The elevated heart rate. The heightened sensitivity in his hands. The awareness that the next 20 minutes contained a variable he had never navigated before. Yes, he said. She nodded. Not in sympathy. In the way someone nods when they receive accurate information they were expecting. Good, she said. He looked at her. Why good? Because the shot at 830 meters, the one you weren't scared for, that was a shot inside your framework. You knew the wind, you knew the distance, you'd done it before or close enough. She paused. This shot is outside your framework. The fear is your nervous system telling you to pay attention to things you can't fully control. A beat. Scared shooters who know what they're doing are better than confident shooters who don't know what they're missing. He absorbed that. That's what you were building today, he said. On the range. I was building people who could be scared and shoot anyway. Scared because they understood the actual complexity of what they were doing, not scared because they didn't know enough. She was looking through the spotting scope, now her attention divided between the conversation and the corridor below. Confidence without complexity is just ignorance with good posture. He almost laughed. He didn't. But the impulse was there, and it was real, and it told him something about what the day had done to the distance between them. 8 minutes. Maya's hand moved to her transmitter. She keyed the team channel. 8 minutes to window. Final check. Reeves ran a wind check at position 1. Ford confirmed her data at position 2. Caldwell ran his own numbers and cross-referenced against what Maya was reading through the spotting scope. They matched closely. Not perfectly. His surface wind read was 0.5 mile per hour slower than hers. Your read or mine, he said. She didn't hesitate. Mine. I'm reading the corridor vegetation, not the flags. The vegetation is more accurate at this distance. He adjusted his dope. Thank you, he said. She looked at him briefly. It was a look he couldn't fully categorize, but it registered. He had said thank you for a correction. He had accepted her data over his own without requiring it to be argued. He had done it as a reflex, not as a deliberate act of humility. That was the difference he realized. Deliberate humility was still about the self. What he had just done was about the shot. About Rourke. About the 40 meters. 5 minutes. Maya transmitted to Rourke. 2 pulses. Standby. The response came back immediately. 1 pulse. Ready. 1 pulse. From a man lying in cover 11 days into a forward position with a 4-second window and 40 meters between him and extraction. 1 pulse meaning, I'm here. I'm ready. I trust you, go. Caldwell felt the weight of that pulse like something physical. 3 minutes, Maya said on the team channel. Position 1 fires on my mark. Position 2 fires 2 seconds after position 1. Position 3. She paused. Position 3 fires on my direct call, not on a count, on my call. Confirmed, Caldwell said. Rourke moves on the first shot from position 1. By the time he's at the 10-meter mark, position 3 needs to be firing. The math was simple and brutal. Reeves fires. Rourke starts moving. 2 seconds. Ford fires. 2 more seconds. Rourke is at the 10-meter mark of his 40-meter run. Maya calls. Caldwell fires. Threat eliminated. Rourke completes the run in the remaining seconds. Ground element receives him at the far end. Every variable locked into every other variable, with the interdependence of a mechanism where any component failing meant the mechanism failed completely. 2 minutes. Caldwell breathed. He found the target through the scope. He had ranged it on setup, confirmed it twice since. He knew exactly where the round needed to go. He knew his dope. He knew his wind data. He had Maya's correction loaded. He was ready. He was also still scared. He decided that was exactly right. 1 minute. The dark below them was still. Somewhere in it, Rourke was in the last 60 seconds of 11 days of waiting. Somewhere in it, 3 threat elements were static on the ridgeline, unaware that the geometry of their position was about to become the geometry of their ending. Somewhere in it, 40 meters of open ground were about to become the most important distance in the world. 30 seconds. Caldwell's finger moved to the trigger guard. Not on the trigger. Beside it. Ready. Maya was completely still beside him. The spotting scope steadied her voice, a controlled thread of sound that carried no fear and no excitement. Just information. Just accuracy. Just the specific quality of someone who had reduced everything unnecessary and kept only what mattered. 15 seconds. He breathed out. Held the empty lung. The way you do. 10. The dark below didn't change. The wind moved in its layers. His dope was loaded. Her data was in it. 5. One pulse from Rourke, still living in his earpiece like a heartbeat. Mark. Reeves fired. The sound of position 1 came across the dark like a statement. Clean. Decisive. Caldwell heard it and started counting in his body, not in his head. 1 count. 2 seconds. Ford fired. 2 count. Rourke is moving, Maya said. Her voice was the same, steady, reading. Wind holding, your dope is good. 3 count, 10 meters. Hold 4 count. Fire. He fired. The rifle moved in his shoulder, the way it always moved, controlled, known, incorporated. His eye stayed on the scope, through the recoil the way he had trained it to for 3 decades. The impact was immediate, confirmed, exact. Hit, Maya said. The word was flat and factual and carried everything. Rourke is running. Caldwell worked the bolt, chambered a second round, stayed on scope. Threat 2 is mobile, Maya said, and her voice had changed. Not panic, but the elevated precision of someone processing fast-moving information. Reeves threat 2, your left 40 meters. Reeves fired before she finished the sentence. Hit. Threat 3 is static holding. A beat. Ford threat 3, confirm your position. Confirmed, Ford said. Fire when ready. Ford fired. Hit. Rourke is at 30 meters. A pause that lasted less than a second, but felt longer. He's at 40. He's in cover. Garza confirm receipt. Garza's voice came through the ground element channel. We have him. He's mobile. He's good. The transmission ended. The dark on the ridgeline was completely silent. Caldwell lay in position for 3 more seconds. Then he exhaled the full breath, the one that had been managed and controlled and held in the architecture of the shot, and felt it leave his body like something that had been carrying weight. Clear, Maya said on the team channel. All positions hold for 30 seconds, then we move on my signal. Nobody spoke. 30 seconds in the dark on a ridgeline after a shot that had worked was its own specific kind of experience. Not celebration. Operators didn't celebrate in position. Not relief, exactly. Relief came later when the debrief was done, and the equipment was stowed, and the physical distance from the operation allowed the nervous system to reclassify the event as past. It was more like the moment after a held breath. Not the breath itself, the moment after. Caldwell felt it in his hands first. The slight tremor that came not from fear, but from the release of the sustained control that a shot required. His hands knew what had happened. His body was processing it in the order that bodies processed things: physiology, first cognition, second meaning somewhere after both. Beside him, Maya lowered the spotting scope. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said almost to herself, 11 days. 2 words. But Caldwell understood the entire sentence they contained. The 11 days of Rourke's forward position. The planning that had preceded them. The evaluation on the range. The morning's dismissal and the afternoon's revelation and the briefing and the approach and the wait and the 4-second window that had held every variable of every decision made in the preceding hours. All of it had been in service of a man running 40 meters in the dark, and the man was in cover. "Signal," Maya said on the team channel. "We move." Caldwell rose from position and pulled the rifle with him and followed her back into the dark, and he understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with what the day had done to him, that he was not the same man who had arrived at Black Ridge this morning. He had arrived as a colonel who ran his range. How was leaving as something he didn't have a clean title for, yet a man who had been shown the edges of his own framework and had chosen in the moment of choosing to step past them. 2 kilometers into the return approach, Reeves pulled even with him again. "Colonel?" "Reeves." A pause. "Hell of a shot." Caldwell looked at him. "She called it." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "I know. That's what I mean." Caldwell looked at him. "You trusted the call," Reeves said. "On that shot, with those conditions, you trusted her call." A pause. "I've worked under 4 different mission commanders in the last 3 years. I've never seen a colonel first operation under a new commander take the call without flinching." He paused again. "I watched you through my position optics during the window. You didn't move until she said fire, not a tenth of a second early." Caldwell said nothing. "I'm just saying," Reeves said, "that the shot was one thing. That was the other thing." He fell back into his position in the column. Caldwell moved through the dark and carried that with him. He thought about what Reeves had said, about what it meant that a decorated operator considered the ability to wait for a call to hold in the moment when every instinct and 30 years of experience were telling you that you knew enough to fire as significant as the accuracy of the shot itself. He thought about the range, about the 16 operators who had missed the canyon target because they were solving a 3-variable problem with a 1-variable solution, about the framework he had built across 31 years that tested individuals against a fixed standard and called the result merit. I thought about the moment he had looked at Maya Voss standing in his staging area with a worn rifle case and no name tape and made in approximately 3 seconds a judgment that had been completely wrong. Not wrong because she had credentials he hadn't checked. Wrong because he had asked, "Does she belong here?" instead of "What is she here to do?" 1 kilometer from the vehicle pickup point. Maya dropped back in the column and fell in beside him. She didn't speak immediately. They moved together for 30 seconds before she said anything. "You held the shot," she said. "You called it. There's a version of tonight where a colonel with 31 years of trigger experience doesn't hold the shot," she said. "Where he fires when his own read tells him to fire and the timing is off and the window is wrong." She paused. "I've seen that version. Different ridgeline, different team, different outcome." Caldwell looked at her in the dark. "What happened?" "The shot was technically accurate," she said. "But it was early, by 2 seconds." A pause. "Rourke wasn't at 10 meters yet. He was still in cover. The threat that the shot eliminated the movement it caused in the threat's position revealed Rourke's location for approximately 1 second before he moved." She was quiet. 1 second is enough." The air between them was dense with what she wasn't saying directly. "Someone didn't come home," Caldwell said. "Someone didn't come home," she confirmed. She didn't explain further. She didn't elaborate on who or when or what the other variable had been. She just carried it beside him in the dark, the way she apparently carried everything without theater, without the performance of weight, but with the actual presence of it. Caldwell understood then why she had designed the range evaluation the way she had. It wasn't an academic exercise. It wasn't a training methodology built from theory. It was built from a specific and irreversible experience of what happened when a shooter trusted his own read over the call from someone with better information. She had built a training environment to prevent a repeat of something she had already lived. That was the framework she carried. Not a curriculum. A loss. The vehicle was waiting at the pickup point. They loaded in the same quiet that they had unloaded, and the door closed, and the vehicle moved, and the darkness of the approach became the darkness of transit, and something in the collective physiology of the team shifted the mission, moving from present to past, the body beginning its slow reclassification of danger as memory. In the back of the vehicle, Caldwell sat across from Maya. She had her eyes closed. Not sleeping, her posture was still operational, still carrying a residual readiness that wouldn't fully stand down until they were debriefed and physically back at the installation. But her face had a different quality. The specific quality of someone who had been managing something for a very long time and had for the moment been allowed to stop. Rourke was in the vehicle 2 positions ahead. Caldwell could hear his voice quiet Garza beside him, the low exchange of 2 people, making sure the other was real. 11 days in a forward position, and now the sound of someone who knew him saying his name in the dark. He heard Rourke say something, and heard Garza respond, and heard Rourke laugh, a short, rough sound, the laugh of someone who has been afraid for a long time and is now, for the first time in days, allowed to feel something else. Maya opened her eyes at the sound. She was looking at the partition between the compartments, toward Rourke's voice. And in her face, for the first time all day, Caldwell saw something that was not contained and not measured, and not the product of training. Just relief. Simple human complete. She closed her eyes again. Caldwell looked at his hands. The slight tremor was gone. His hands were steady, the way they always were after a shot had settled into the past. But something else in them felt different. Some quality of how they held themselves. Some awareness they had acquired tonight that they hadn't carried this morning. He thought about what Reeves had said. You trusted the call. I thought about what Maya had said on the range to 40 operators who had been failing at a target they were technically capable of hitting. The right question is not what did I do incorrectly. The right question is what did I fail to see. He had failed to see for 31 years that the framework he'd built was not the only framework. That the standard he measured people against was not the only standard. That the things his range tested were real and important, and also profoundly incomplete. He had built a world that produced extraordinary individual shooters, and then sent them into situations that required something his world hadn't trained. He had failed to see it because nobody had asked him the right question. Tonight, on a ridgeline in the dark, with 4 wind variables and a 4-second window and a man running 40 meters on someone else's call, he had finally been given the question. And he had answered it. Not perfectly, not without fear, but correctly in the moment that mattered, in the way that cost him the thing it needed to cost him. He looked across the vehicle at Maya's closed eyes and thought about the fact that she had asked about his shooting record before she got off the helicopter. That she had known before she walked onto his range that she might need him. That his dismissal of her had not changed that calculation, because the calculation was not about her and him, it was about Rourke and the ridgeline and the shot that needed to happen. She had looked past what he'd done to what he could do. He had spent the day learning to do the same thing. The vehicle kept moving through the dark, and somewhere ahead of them at Black Ridge, the canyon target was still standing at 940 meters. And the wind was still moving in its 3 invisible layers, and the range that Caldwell had built over 31 years was waiting to be rebuilt into something that could produce the kind of operator that tonight had required. He already knew he was going to do it. I didn't know yet exactly what it would look like. But for the first time in 31 years, he was genuinely curious to find out. The debrief lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Standard protocol. Every decision documented. Every timeline reconstructed, every variable that had been managed, and every variable that had surprised them, laid out on the table in the flat, precise language that after-action reports required. Maya ran it the same way she ran everything, without ceremony, without the inflation of drama that people sometimes brought to debrief rooms when the operation had gone well, and the temptation was to let the success color the analysis. She didn't let it. Position 3 wind data, she said, looking at her notes. My read on the corridor vegetation gave me a number that diverged from Position 3's instrument read by half a mile per hour. That divergence produced a dope adjustment that was incorporated into the shot. The shot confirmed the adjustment was correct. She looked up. But I want to document that the divergence existed and that it was resolved by verbal communication in the window. If communication had been compromised at that moment, Position 3 would have fired on instrument data alone. Caldwell said, and the shot would have gone left. By approximately 8 inches at that distance, she said, which at the target geometry would have been a miss. 8 inches. The number sat on the table in the debrief room, and nobody moved it. Reeves said, "So the communication dependency was a vulnerability." "Every dependency is a vulnerability," Maya said. "The question is whether the vulnerability was acceptable given the alternatives." She looked at her notes again. The alternative was Position 3 operating without real-time wind data from a forward observation point. Given the four-variable environment and the dynamic conditions during the window-independent operation, would have produced a lower probability of first-round impact. A pause. The communication dependency was the right call. But it needs to be documented so the next team that runs a similar geometry understands where the fragility is. Caldwell watched her do this, the specific discipline of not letting a successful outcome erase the record of what could have gone wrong, and felt something that had been shifting in him all day click into a final position. This was what rigor actually looked like. Not the rigor of a fixed standard applied uniformly. The rigor of honest accounting. Of looking at a shot that worked and asking not just why did it work, but what would have broken it, and how do we make sure the next team knows? His range had never run a debrief that way. His debriefs had documented outcomes, pass or fail, hit or miss, under standard or above it. They had never documented the 8 inches. When the debrief ended and the room cleared, Caldwell stayed in his seat. Maya was collecting her notes. Hollister had already taken the logistics documentation back to the operations center. Park was shutting down the secure communications equipment. The room went quiet. Maya looked up and found him still there. "Something you want to add," she said. "I want to know about the other ridgeline," he said. "The one you mentioned in the vehicle, the one where someone didn't come home." She was still for a moment. Then she closed her notes folder and sat back down. 14 months ago, she said. Different theater. Similar geometry, downhill shot, multi-layer wind-tight window. She was looking at the table, not at him, but her voice was steady. The shooter on the critical position had a better record than anyone I'd worked with up to that point. Technically exceptional. The kind of record that makes selection officers do a double take. What happened? He fired 1.8 seconds before my call. She was quiet for a moment. His read on the wind was that the window was opening early. He wasn't wrong about the wind. He was right about it. The window was opening early. Another pause. He was also right that his shot was accurate. The impact was where it needed to be. Caldwell waited. What he didn't know, she said, was that Rourke, the asset in that operation, different name, same situation, had a micro-delay in his movement signal. A 2-second lag in the communication chain between my call and his earpiece. Equipment we didn't know about until afterward. She looked up. The shooter fired on his own read. His read was correct. His shot was accurate. His timing was right by the data available to him. She stopped, and the 2-second equipment lag meant the asset wasn't moving yet when the shot changed the threat's position, Caldwell said. I was still in cover. The movement the shot caused the reaction in the threat position swept the cover point. She said it simply without editorial. Just the sequence of events. He was out in 2 seconds. He made it. But he took a round. A pause. He survived. He lost the use of his left hand. She looked at Caldwell directly. His name is Marcus Webb. He's at Walter Reed. He plays guitar. He played it with both hands before that operation. The room was completely silent. The shooter who fired early, Maya said, made the right call with the information he had. I want to be clear about that. He was not reckless. He was not arrogant. He read the conditions correctly and made a decision that his experience told him was sound. She paused. But he made it alone. In the moment when he had enough data to feel certain, he stopped listening for my call because he already knew. Another pause. And the thing he didn't know, the equipment lag. The 2-second delay was exactly the kind of variable that I would have known about, and he couldn't have. Caldwell held her gaze. That's why you stand at position 3. That's why I stand at position 3, she said. Every time. And tonight. Tonight you held the shot, she said. With better wind data than your instruments were giving you, and a read that your 31 years were probably telling you was sufficient. You held it. Her voice didn't change, but something in it acknowledged what that had cost him. Marcus Webb's left hand is why I designed the canyon course the way I designed it. It's why I test for adaptation and not accuracy. It's why I built an evaluation that required operators to say, I don't have enough information before they could succeed. She paused. Accuracy is table stakes. I can find accurate shooters anywhere. What I cannot find easily are people who can be accurate and uncertain at the same time. Who can hold the shot when they think they know. Caldwell looked at his hands on the table. I removed you from this range this morning, he said. You did. I looked at you and made a complete judgment in 3 seconds based on what I could see and what I already believed about who belonged here. Yes. He looked up. I was doing exactly what your canyon course tests for. I had incomplete information and I acted on certainty. Yes, she said again. Her voice was simple. Not forgiving forgiveness wasn't what the moment required, just accurate. I've been doing it for 31 years, he said. Not just this morning. The range, the evaluations, the framework. Every operator who came through here was tested against a standard that I built from what I knew, and everything I didn't know stayed outside the fence line. He paused. The same way I put you outside the fence line. Maya looked at him for a long moment. What are you going to do about it? She said. Not a challenge, a real question. He had been thinking about it since the vehicle. Since the debrief, since the moment on the ridgeline when he had held the shot and felt in the holding of it the entire shape of what he had never done before. I'm going to rebuild the evaluation, he said. The canyon course stays. That gets incorporated permanently. But the debrief protocol changes. We document the 8 inches, not just the hit. We document what would have broken the shot, not just what made it work. He paused. And I'm going to bring in operators who failed in the field. Not as cautionary examples, as instructors. Because the people who have failed in ways that cost them something are the ones who understand what the 8 inches mean. Maya was quiet. And I'm going to change the intake process, he said. The roster system. The way we credential people for access to this range. A pause that cost him something. Because the system I had would have kept you outside the fence line all day, and the mission would have failed. She looked at him steadily. That last one is going to be the hardest one. I know. Because it means admitting that the gate you built wasn't keeping weakness out. It was keeping your uncertainty out. He held her gaze. I know that too. She studied him. The same way she had studied him in the staging area this morning. Patient precise reading. Something that wasn't fully visible on the surface. Then she said, I'm going to send you Marcus Webb's contact information. He looked at her. He consults now. Range design evaluation methodology, pre-mission preparation protocols. He's been doing it for 10 months. She paused. He's going to tell you things about what his training didn't prepare him for that will be uncomfortable to hear. I want you to hear them anyway. I will, Caldwell said. He's also going to tell you that the shooter who fired early came to see him at Walter Reed, she said. Came 3 times, sat with him, didn't make excuses, just sat there. She paused. Marcus told me that those visits mattered more to him than the medal he received for the operation. Because the shooter didn't have to come. He came because he understood that being technically right and being fully responsible for what your decision produced are not the same thing. Caldwell absorbed that completely. The shooter, he said. Is he still operational? He requested assignment to my evaluation program 6 months ago, Maya said. He's been helping me design the adaptive assessment components. A pause. He's the one who suggested putting the canyon target at 940 meters instead of 800. He said the extra distance was the difference between operators who almost understood the problem and operators who completely understood it. Something in Caldwell's chest shifted. He's been building the course, Caldwell said. He's been building it alongside me, she said. Because he understands what the 8 inches cost, and he doesn't want anyone else to find out the same way he did. The silence in the debrief room had a quality that neither of them moved to break for a long moment. Then Maya stood and picked up her notes folder and said, Get some sleep, Colonel. The formal review with Admiral Whitfield is at 0900. She moved toward the door. Commander? She stopped, turned. "Thank you," he said, "for not telling the Admiral why you were outside the fence line." She looked at him for a moment. "I told him everything." He stared at her. "I told him you removed me from the range that I observed from outside the perimeter, and that the way you received me provided valuable data about the range culture that confirmed my pre-assessment." She held his gaze. "I also told him that by the end of the day, you had demonstrated a capacity for adaptation that made you the right person for Position 3. A pause. "He asked me if I was recommending you for continued involvement with the evaluation program." Caldwell waited. "I told him I was recommending you for something more significant than that," she said. "I told him that Black Ridge, under a restructured approach, could become the best adaptive precision training program in the military." Another pause. "And that the person best positioned to build it was the person who had spent 31 years building the version that needed to be replaced." She walked out. Caldwell sat in the empty debrief room for 3 full minutes. Then he stood, picked up his notes, and went to find Hollister. He found him in the operations center running post-mission documentation. Hollister looked up when Caldwell came in and read his expression with the accuracy of someone who had worked alongside him long enough to have learned the full vocabulary of it. "Sir, I need the full range evaluation records for the past 5 years, Caldwell said. "Every assessment, every outcome, every operator profile. I want to look at who we passed and who we cut and what the data actually shows about where those operators are now." Hollister looked at him for a moment. "That's going to be a significant review, sir." "Yes." "You want to start tonight?" Caldwell looked at the operations center clock. It was past 0200. The Whitfield review was at 0900. "Tomorrow," he said. "After the review." He paused. "But I want the files pulled and ready." "Yes, sir." Hollister turned to his terminal. Then without looking up he said, "Sir, for what it's worth." "Say it, Hollister." "I've been on this range for 8 years. I've watched a lot of evaluations." He kept his eyes on the terminal. "Today was the first one where I learned something." A pause. "And not from the evaluation." Caldwell looked at him for a moment. "Pull the files," he said, and walked out. The next morning came with the specific flatness of mornings after operations, the world looking ordinary in a way that felt faintly incorrect, as if the intensity of the preceding hours should have left some visible mark on the light or the air or the physical architecture of the installation. It never did. The range looked the same. The operations center looked the same. The canyon sat at the same distance, with the same invisible wind layers running through it in their 3 distinct and overlapping patterns. Caldwell arrived in the conference room for the Whitfield review at 0847. Maya was already there. Rourke was beside her the first time Caldwell had seen him in daylight in person as a full human being, rather than as a tactical variable. He was younger than Caldwell had expected. Mid-30s, lean with the particular quality that forward position operators acquired after extended deployments, a kind of hyper-present attentiveness, like someone whose nervous system had been recalibrated by sustained operational stress into a permanently elevated state of environmental awareness. His left hand was bandaged. Not heavily a field wrap functional. He was using it. But there was a carefulness in how he used it that told its own story. He stood when Caldwell entered, not at attention. Just stood the way you stand when someone enters a room and you want them to know you see them. "Colonel Caldwell," he said. "Chief Rourke." Caldwell stopped in front of him, extended his hand. Rourke took it. His grip was firm and direct. "Glad you were on that ridgeline," Rourke said. Caldwell held his gaze. "Glad you ran the 40 meters. Something passed between them that wasn't language. The specific acknowledgement that exists between people who have been briefly and irrevocably variables in each other's survival. It didn't require elaboration. It required exactly what it got. Eye contact, a handshake, and the honest weight of 2 men who understood what the other had done. Rourke sat back down beside Maya. Caldwell took his seat. Admiral Whitfield arrived at exactly 0900. The way flag officers arrived when the review they were conducting was one they considered important. Not early, not late, but precisely on time, in the manner that communicated that every minute of this meeting was intentional. He sat. He looked at the room. His eyes moved from Maya to Rourke to Caldwell, and back to Maya. "Mission outcome," he said. "Asset recovered," Maya said. "Physically intact, operationally complete. 3 threat elements neutralized within the extraction window. Ground element executed without contact. Team exfil was clean." She paused. "One variable that needs to be documented. Position 3 communication dependency during the wind data exchange. The dependency was managed successfully, but represents a protocol vulnerability for future operations using similar geometry." Whitfield nodded. He looked at Caldwell. "Position 3. "Sir," Caldwell said, "Commander Voss recommended you for that position after you removed her from this range." Whitfield said it flatly without inflection, designed to make it land harder than it already did. "I want your assessment of that decision. Hers, not mine." Caldwell thought about the precise answer. "She selected for the ability to take a call under conditions that made independent judgment feel more reliable," he said. "She determined based on the day's events that I had demonstrated that capacity in a context that was directly relevant to the mission geometry." He paused. "She was willing to put the mission outcome in the hands of someone who had acted against her that morning because she assessed that what she had seen in me since was more operationally significant than what I had done before." Whitfield looked at him for a moment. "And was she right?" "The shot confirmed the call," Caldwell said. "So yes." "I'm not asking about the shot," Whitfield said. "I'm asking about the assessment. Was she right about you?" A longer pause. "She saw something I hadn't shown anyone in 31 years, Caldwell said. "So either she was right or she created the conditions that made it true. I'm not sure there's a practical difference." Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Maya. "You said you wanted to make a program recommendation." "I did," Maya said. She opened her folder. "Black Ridge has the infrastructure, the terrain, and the institutional history to become the primary adaptive precision training program for Joint Special Operations. The Canyon course, as modified and currently configured, is the foundation. The evaluation methodology needs to be rebuilt around collaborative problem-solving rather than individual performance benchmarking." She looked up. "I'm recommending Colonel Caldwell as the program director with a co-design mandate that brings in operators who have experienced adaptive failure in operational contexts as primary instructional staff." Whitfield looked at Caldwell. "You'd be giving up operational command to run a training program." "I'd be giving up a training program that was producing the wrong result," Caldwell said, "to build one that produces the right one." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant statement from a man who has defined his career by the program he built." "The program I built produced excellent individual shooters," Caldwell said. "Commander Voss showed me that excellent individual shooters in the situations that matter most are not enough." He held Whitfield's gaze. "I spent 31 years building something I was proud of. I'd like to spend however many years I have left building something that actually works." The room was quiet. Rourke said without preamble or setup, "Sir, with respect, I'd like to say something." Whitfield looked at him. "Go ahead, Chief." "I was in a forward position for 11 days, Rourke said. "I had 2 communication windows per day and no ability to affect any decision being made on my behalf. Everything that happened on that ridgeline last night, every choice, every call, every shot, I had to trust completely without being able to see any of it." He paused. "I've trusted Commander Voss with my life more than once. Last night, I also trusted a colonel I'd never met, whose shot I couldn't see coming, whose name I didn't know until Maya told me this morning." He looked at Caldwell. "The shot was perfect. The timing was exact. And I found out this morning that it was his first operational shot under her command." A pause. "I want to go on record that the program he's proposing to build, the one that produces the kind of shooter who can do what he did last night on the first try under those conditions, that program is the difference between people like me coming home and not coming home." Whitfield looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have the program authorization on your desk by end of week, Colonel." Caldwell nodded. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Whitfield said. Build it right. The review concluded 20 minutes later. The formal elements completed the documentation, signed the chain of decisions that had begun with a walk-on arriving at a gate and ended with a man running 40 meters in the dark, officially entered into the record. As the room cleared, Rourke stopped beside Caldwell. He reached into his jacket and produced a small object, a challenge coin, the kind that operators carried and exchanged in moments that mattered. He held it out. Caldwell took it. He looked at it. On one side a sealed trident, on the other a set of coordinates. That's where I was, Rourke said. The position, 11 days. He paused. I carry one for every place I've had to trust someone I couldn't see. He looked at Caldwell directly. You're the first person from outside the teams who's ever gotten one. Caldwell closed his hand around the coin. I'll carry it, he said. I know, Rourke said, and walked out. Maya was the last one in the room. She was standing at the window, not looking out at anything specific, just standing in the way. She sometimes stood with the quality of someone whose internal process was running separate from their physical location. Caldwell crossed the room and stood beside her. They were quiet for a moment. Then she said, 14 months ago, after Marcus, I almost stopped running these evaluations. He looked at her. I thought the problem was the geometry, she said. The shot type, the position, the communication dependency. I redesigned the technical protocol 4 times. I changed the team selection criteria twice. She paused. It took me 6 months to understand that the problem wasn't the geometry. The problem was that I was selecting for the best individual performance and hoping that individuals would collaborate when it mattered. She looked at the coin in his hand. I was doing what your range did, testing for what I could measure and calling it the complete picture. He looked at her. What changed it? Marcus, she said simply. Watching him at Walter Reed, watching him go from anger at the shooter at me at the operation to something else, something that took longer. She paused. He started asking about 3 months and what he could have done differently. Not the shooter himself. What he could have done that would have made the 2-second delay visible before the mission. She looked at the window. He said the honest answer was nothing. With the information available to him, there was nothing he could have done. But he said the question was still worth asking, because the asking changed how he thought about future operations. It made him more interested in what other people knew that he didn't. A pause. He said that was the most useful thing the experience gave him. More curiosity about other people's information. Caldwell thought about that. About 31 years of building a range that tested what he knew and never asked what he didn't. That's what you were building yesterday, he said. The curiosity. I was testing for pre-existing curiosity, she said. The Canyon course identifies who already asks the right questions. What I'm hoping your program builds is the training environment that teaches people to ask them before they need them. She looked at him. You can't teach people to be curious about what they don't know in a moment of crisis. You have to build the habit before the crisis. In training, in evaluation, in the daily practice of being on a range and asking not just did I hit the target, but what was I missing? She turned to face him fully. That's the program, she said. That's what it needs to do. Caldwell held her gaze. I understand. Do you? She said. Not a challenge. A real question, the same kind she'd asked him in the operations center the night before. The kind that required a real answer. I understand it the way someone understands something they haven't finished learning yet, he said. I understand the shape of it. I'm going to spend the next however many years learning the interior. Something shifted in her face. The thing that had been contained and measured and professionally calibrated all day, all 2 days, released finally into something that was simply human. That's the right answer, she said. First one I've gotten right without your correction, he said. She almost smiled. You've gotten several right without my correction. Name one that didn't start with me getting it wrong first. She considered this. The shot. He looked at her. You held the shot, she said. Nobody taught you that this week. You came to this range already carrying whatever it took to hold that shot when your read was telling you to fire. I didn't give you that. She paused. I just asked you a question that made it available. I thought about that. About the difference between what people carried and what conditions allowed them to use. What question, he said. Whether you could trust someone else's read over your own, she said. In the moment when your own read felt more reliable. She paused. You said yes, and then you proved it. He looked at the coin in his hand. The coordinates of a forward position where a man had spent 11 days waiting for a team he couldn't see. Where are you going next? He said. There's another evaluation, she said. Different installation, different terrain geometry, similar problem set. She paused. There's always another evaluation. And another ridgeline after that. And another one after that, she said. He nodded. Be safe. She looked at him for a moment. Build it right, she said. Exactly what Whitfield had said. But in her voice it carried a different weight, not instruction, not authority. Something between a challenge and a request. The voice of someone who had designed a canyon course out of a loss and had spent 14 months building toward the moment where the program she couldn't create alone would finally have someone to create it. I will, he said. She picked up her folder and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. She didn't turn around. Colonel. Commander. The canyon course, she said. The target at 940 meters. A pause. The operator who suggested moving it out from 800, who said the extra distance was the difference between operators who almost understood the problem and operators who completely understood it. She paused. His name is Lieutenant Commander Aaron Reyes. He's going to contact you next week about the program design. Another pause. He was the shooter on the ridgeline 14 months ago, the one who fired early. Caldwell said nothing. He's been building this program alongside me because he understands exactly what the 8 inches cost, she said. And he wants to make sure the next colonel who comes through a gate and looks at someone with a worn rifle case and no name tape asks the right question before he opens his mouth. She paused. He wants to make sure the next person doesn't find out the way he did, and the way you did, that what you can't see is exactly what matters most. She walked out. Caldwell stood in the empty room. He opened his hand and looked at the coin. The trident. The coordinates. The weight of a man's trust extended across 40 meters of open ground in the dark, to a shooter he had never seen on a call he couldn't hear. Coming from a woman who had once been his swim buddy and had never once stopped being worth following into the worst places the job produced. He closed his hand around it. He walked to the window and looked at the canyon. At the target sitting 940 meters away, with the invisible wind running through it in its 3 distinct and overlapping layers that had defeated 17 operators before they understood what they were missing. He thought about what he was going to build. Not a range that tested what he knew. A range that revealed what no one had thought to ask yet. I thought about Reyes, who had fired early and spent 14 months building the course that would teach other people not to. He thought about Marcus Webb at Walter Reed, learning to play guitar with a hand that had paid the price of a 2-second lag in a communication chain. He thought about Rourke on a ridgeline for 11 days running 40 meters on a word. He thought about Hollister saying today was the first one where I learned something. He thought about Chen and Ford and Reeves and Bauman hitting the canyon target in the afternoon after missing it all morning, and the specific quality of the silence that followed each successful impact, not celebration, but recognition. The sound of understanding arriving. I thought about a woman walking onto his range with a worn rifle case and no name tape and the 3 seconds it had taken him to decide she didn't belong. And he thought about what she had carried into those 3 seconds. Every ridgeline, every forward position, every shot, called and held and made and missed, every operator she had built, and everyone she had lost. 14 months of redesigning a protocol out of a loss. She took personally, because she was the kind of person who took losses personally and used them, carrying all of that and absorbing his dismissal without a word, without a credential produced, without anything except a nod, and the willingness to wait outside the fence line for as long as it took, because the mission was not about her and him, and it never had been. That was what a legend looked like. Not the shot, not the record, not the call sign or the classified file or the resume that made selection officers do a double take. The willingness to be invisible when invisibility served the mission. The willingness to wait. The willingness to let the person who removed you from the range become the person who makes the shot that brings someone home. The willingness to see in the man who got it wrong the person who could get it right. Ethan Caldwell stood at the window of a conference room at Black Ridge Special Operations Range and made a decision that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with what the previous 24 hours had built in him. He was going to spend the rest of his career teaching people to ask the question they were most afraid the answer would cost them. Not does she belong here, but what is she here to do? Because the answer to the second question was always the one that mattered. And the people who learned to ask it, who learned to hold their certainty, one breath longer than was comfortable, who learned to wait for a call in the moment when their own read felt sufficient, who learned to look at a worn rifle case and an absent name tape and ask what they were missing rather than announcing what they already knew, those people brought others home. And the ones who didn't learn it found out eventually, and at cost, exactly what the 8 inches meant. He put the coin in his chest pocket. He picked up his notes. He walked out of the conference room and toward the range where the canyon waited and the wind ran in its invisible layers and the target sat at 940 meters, exactly far enough to be the difference between almost understanding and understanding completely. He had work to do, and for the first time in 31 years, he had no idea exactly how it would turn out. That he understood now was precisely the point. A warrior who had never known uncertainty had never been tested by anything worthy of the name. But a warrior who walked into uncertainty with open hands, and a willingness to learn, who held the shot until the call came, who asked what he'd failed to see instead of what he'd done wrong, who recognized the legend not by her rank, but by the quality of her stillness. That warrior was worth something that no evaluation score had ever measured. Ethan Caldwell had spent 31 years building a range. He was finally ready to build something that deserved the name.